I hold in my hand an obituary and a eulogy and a funeral sermon that I preached in October 2000. It was a privilege and honor to be able to be asked to do that, because it was for one of the men in the church that I preached for in Atlanta, Missouri. His name was Glenn Harpster. And Glenn was indeed a man of faith. And and so I had the privilege of sharing with people about his life. But one of the things you need to know about me, I actually like preaching funerals. And before you go, my goodness, Jeff, you're so morbid. No, I know that it's a sad occasion. I've sat out there in those seats with people friends that have died, or with the family of the family's friends of someone who's died, and I felt their sorrow. And I sit there on that front row with ones that I've loved that are lying in that casket. And I've stood behind the pulpit many more times preaching those things, because here's the thing I like about doing funerals, and it's the main thing. There's several reasons I'd rather preach a funeral than like a wedding and things like that, is that what happens is God often puts me right in the middle of that person's or that family's grief whenever it takes place. For some reason, God shoves me right into the middle of the grief, and I'm able to be an encourager, a helper, and one who lifts them up during a time of sorrow. I always do that, though, by directing their thoughts to Jesus. Every single time. Maybe different approaches, different ways of doing it, different passages of Scripture, different concepts, but I always at least get to the point where I direct them to Jesus, because Jesus is the only source of true comfort. And Jesus is the only source of eternal, lasting comfort. And so they need to look to Jesus more than to me, or more than to others around them for their help. And so one of the things I like to do, if I know the person well enough, and I've done a lot of funerals for people I've never met in my life, but if I know the person well enough, I like to look into the Bible and find an individual that's in the Bible that the person I'm preaching the funeral for has some of the same characteristics of. And to draw those things out, and to show the life and the legacy of that individual through biblical eyes. And I did that with Glenn's funeral. And what I did is I could see very easily the corresponding characteristics between Caleb of the Bible and Glenn Harpster. And so let me share a little bit of this with you, so that you can see what I'm talking about. One of the things I noted was that Caleb left a legacy to his family and left a legacy to Israel, to all who followed the true God as Caleb did. I noted he believed in, he was faithful, and he was obedient to God. And as the Scripture says, he followed the Lord God of Israel fully. Now, wouldn't that be cool to put on your tombstone? He followed, or she followed, the Lord God fully. What a legacy to leave behind, even just in the carving of a tombstone, because that's the character of the person that you were. Well, I saw similar in Caleb, and Caleb that left a legacy, or in Glenn. Now, Caleb, the first thing I noted, was strong all his years. He was productive. He was never wavering and doing well, doing right with God. And that's what I saw in Glenn Harpster, too. Glenn had a very strong work ethic. He wasn't lazy. He was always on top of things, and he was very creative about it as well. Another thing I noted about Caleb is that Caleb influenced people. And people looked up to him, and they respected his example of faith and courage. And it's why? Because he trusted the one true living God. Well, Glenn influenced many people. He was an elder in the church. That is a position of influence, whether you mean for it to be or not, from your perspective. He had a business at Harpster's Implements. It was a farming area. He had a implement business where they sold used stuff, as well as did repairs and ammonium nitrate for spreading on the fields when there wasn't enough snow in the wintertime. If you complain about too much snow, please don't. because it saves on the food bill in the spring and summer, because then they don't have to buy the stuff to get on the ground that you would normally get through the snow going into the soil. But what he used to do was he would give, with the regular business letter that he has, some devotional thoughts, some scriptures. And so he was influencing people. He influenced me to join the board of the campus ministry up at Truman State University because he saw that need. He was a strong influencer. Caleb, he wanted to take the land of the giants. When it was time to settle the land, he wanted to take the land of the giants. They were known as the Anakim. He believed that God would give him the land as he took the portion of the land that was chosen by him, thus allotted to him. So that's kind of the way Glenn Harpster was too. He was forward thinking. And one of the things that the family constantly mentioned, he was so full of ideas to do something better or more efficiently or more effectively. Some people thought he was crazy. It already works well enough now. He would always try to find ways to make it better. And in other words, he tried to conquer giant circumstances and situations. Another thing about Caleb was he cared about the land that God had promised, and he was giving to the people of Israel as they took possession of the land. And, he cared about the inheritance for his family, and he did so thinking about generations to come after himself. That's the way Glenn Harpster was too. He cared about what was right and what was wrong and doing God's will. He was a caring person. He cared for his family, cared for his church, he cared for those all around. He especially cared about their souls, about their salvation. He was concerned for their welfare, wanting things to be well. You can make a long list of the caring that Glenn had. And there was another thing that I noted about Caleb there. That he was a man who didn't waver in trusting God and his strength and God's promise to give the land to Israel, and in particular the portion that was promised to Caleb himself. Well, we can say that about Glenn Harpster too. He's a man of faith. For 53 years he was a Christian. He died at age 72. For 53 years he was a Christian. He trusted in God's love and mercy and grace for his salvation. And he believed and held on to that eternal promise of God up to the day that he died. Now, the reason I shared that with you is because I want to introduce Caleb to you, but I also want you to see that it's not just the biblical characters in the Bible that can be faithful, and we're faithful to God, but people even today can be in similar ways to what we will see of these different characters in the Bible. We can be faithful like them, just like they were. Caleb teaches us never to give up on God's promises. I found this neat story. I got to share this with you. There's a scrawny kid from West Texas, and he attended a very small high school that didn't have a wrestling program, but he'd read a book on wrestling. And so he asked one of the assistant football coaches if he would enter him in some of the wrestling matches in that region. Well, the coach agreed to help the kid, and this little guy was neither strong nor was he very skillful, but he had one enduring quality: he refused to give up. And he won every single wrestling match because what he did was tenaciously hold on to his opponent to the point that he wore his opponent down. Well, by the end of the season, he was undefeated. He made it all the way to the Texas State Finals for his weight classification. And his opponent was a two-time state champion and was a bona fide college prospect for wrestling. Well, this scrawny little kid went up against the Texas State champion, and the guy made a couple quick moves on the kid, and soon enough, the kid was on his back, about ready to be pinned. The coach knew that his athlete was about to lose, and he just couldn't bear to watch, so he turned his head. Suddenly, he heard the roar of the crowd, and he turned around, and the kid was on top of the state champion, pinning him, and he won the match. Well, the little guy bounces across the mat and hugs the coach, says, "Coach, I won! Coach said, "Sure, son, but I missed it. I turned away just before you were about to lose. What happened?" Kid said, "Coach, that guy was good. He had me twisted up like a pretzel on that mat, but you know me, Coach, I never quit. I refused to give up, so I opened my eyes, and right there in front of my face was a big toe. I didn't even know if it was against the rules or not, but I bit into that big toe with all my strength. And Coach, it's amazing what you can do when you bite your own big toe. Oh my goodness. The thing is, if you've ever been tempted to give up on God and His promises, just remember that little guy who didn't give up at all. Okay? Take a grip on God's promises and don't ever release them, because God honors persistence. And I think that's what we get from Caleb. Okay? At least a little bit. Go with me to Numbers chapter 13. There are going to be two passages that we look at today. First is Numbers 13. You'll know the story pretty well. You know, there were 12 spies that God wanted sent up into the land, and they were chosen, and Moses was giving them some instructions. And so I want to start reading in verse 26 of Numbers 13. It goes like this. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. They reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here's the fruit. Remember, they brought back some fruit, grapes and figs and pomegranates. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we certainly can do it. Okay. That's not the end of the story, but that's the point we want to get to, okay? You know, there's a lot of unbelief in church. There's a lot of unbelief in the church, and church is filled with a lot of unbelievers when you think about it. How do I know that? I didn't pass out a poll to find out, or a survey. Do you believe or not? It's not like that, because you would again. Yes, of course I believe. I do believe God. Here's why I know that there's a lot of unbelief in church, because then church buildings across the country would be filled every Sunday, because they believe in God and not the world, and the excuses and the ways of the world that pull us away from God and the church. I believe there's a lot of unbelief in the church because the truly needy would not be in want, because the church believed in Jesus and His caring for those who are in need, and the responsibility that He has given us to care for them too. I know that there's a lot of unbelief in the church because people would be looking for the supernatural and the miraculous to happen when things happen, especially when we pray to God for help. And when we tell others about Jesus Christ and how that their hearts can change and how our lives would grow even greater in our faith. There's a lot of unbelief in the church, and we could go on with all kinds of ways that looks. Kevin Barry entitled a devotional for his church, Unbelief, the Silent Killer. He begins it this way. This is the first line. Unbelief has been the downfall of many. In other words, the church dies, faith dies because people really do not believe. Gary Amaral wrote in an article on his website, tentmaker.org, most Christians are not aware that they are in as much unbelief as the rest of the world. He calls unbelief the greatest sin and begins the article with these words. The scriptures and Jesus have made it plain that God's own people are always slow to believe what the prophets have spoken. I think you get the picture. Many Christians are Christians only in name. But in their hearts, their minds, and their souls, they're not. They believe by assent. And if you don't know what assent means, it took me a long time to figure it out because I finally had to look it up. Assent means that you agree with something, but that doesn't mean that you follow it. They agree, they believe by assent, but they don't believe by faith and action in their life. They pray to God, but they don't believe that God is going to answer their prayer or that He will deliver or provide the help that they're asking for. Some people don't share their faith because they're more afraid of people than they are in awe of God. Or they don't believe God can save because they don't know that they are saved. They don't feel it. And so they're not sure that God can save. So why should I share that with people? Well, they don't believe God saved them, so they're hanging on, wishing it to be true, but not believing it to be true. Some people don't stand firm and faithful in their Christianity, but they give into the world because they really don't believe in God. Really, they don't believe in God. Or because they're filled with some sin and don't want to be exposed in either world, either the religious world or out in the marketplace, in the rest of the world. And sometimes I think they even think they can hide their unbelief from God by continuing to assent to that belief. People don't look for God's help, for God's provisions, for God's miraculous work because they don't believe. And even if God healed a blind man right here in front of them, many still wouldn't believe. If you don't believe that that's true, go to John 9. Jesus heals a blind man. Right there, and there's people to testify, many people to testify. Jesus did it, and still people wouldn't believe, even though it was done right in front of them. Caleb, on the other hand, believed God's word. And he believed God's promises. And he went into the land of Canaan with the other spies. And these 12 spies saw exactly the same thing. But here's the responsibility that Moses told them. We'll just give you a little bit of what that was. They were told to find out if the people were strong or not. They were told to find out what the land was like. They were to see if the towns were walled and fortified. Or could they be attacked more easily because they're not fortified or they're not very strongly fortified? What's the soil like? Is it going to be fruitful? Try to bring back some of the fruit from the land so we can actually see what you're going to tell us about it. Well, here's what they discovered, essentially two things. One, they returned and they described the land as flowing with milk and honey. And that doesn't mean there's milk flowing down the rivers. Of course, that was sour after a little while, wouldn't it be kind of stinky? And there wasn't honey all over the place, so everywhere you walked it was sticky. I mean, if you were taking it literally, that's what you would picture, right? No, what they're talking about is that a land that is plentiful, can they plant and harvest? Great harvest. Is it going to be a fertile land? And that's what they found, that it was very fertile. It was going to produce rich crops. It was flowing with milk and honey. But then they also found that the people were powerful, and that some of the people were even giants. Now, my favorite team, the Purdue Boilermakers, they've got two boys on that team that are 7'2" and 7'3". Most teams don't even have a 7-footer. Now, you're talking about guys that are a foot taller than me, okay? So, just add a foot. I don't know if I'm even reaching a foot. We're talking about, and we're looking at them and saying, man, those guys are giants, aren't they? And not compared to the guys that these people saw. We're talking people 9, 10, 12 foot tall. If they're 12 foot tall, they're about twice as big as me. Oh, that's huge. We wouldn't have, Doug, we wouldn't have to have them use the ladder so we can change out these bulbs here. They can just reach right up there and do it. Oh, man. They had giants in the land. They were called the Anakim. But you wonder, what was God trying to show Israel by having them do that? What was the discovery the spies meant to convey to Israel? Well, through this land, God is going to provide for them with plenty. The land is going to be fruitful for them. It's very fertile. You're not going to be in want, because when you plant, you're going to get a good harvest. And the second thing is that the people there are powerful, but God's power is greater than theirs, and the victory is going to be magnificent when they take the land by the power of God, and the renown about God and God's people is going to grow. And so what's Caleb step out and do? Let's go. We can do it. He had no doubt. Not the least bit of doubt in his mind. And you got to realize he wasn't trusting in his ability or in the ability of the Israelites to be able to conquer people, because honestly, militarily, they weren't that great. Oh yeah, they had some fighting men and had some skill, but they weren't that powerful. They weren't that great. I think God wanted it that way so that they could show the world that He is the power behind it, not Israel. But if Caleb was trusting in the Israelite army, I think he might have had a different opinion about going into the land. He was trusting God. He wasn't trusting the people. He remembered what God did for Israel, because it was only 2.5 years ago or so that they were freed from slavery in the land of Egypt. He's about 37, 38 years old at this point. It was only about then, whenever they were freed. He's about 40 years old now. He remembers what God did. The rest of Israel seems to forget. And he knew God's promises, just like every other Israelite. He knew the promises God made to Abraham, and to Isaac, and to Jacob, and to Joseph, and all of God's people down through, and how God has always kept his promises. And when God says something, when God promises something, it will happen. And we find that only he and Joshua, the 12 spies, are the ones that believe God. And because of the 10 unbelieving spies, the rest of Israel decided to follow their example, and they failed God and failed to trust God, and so they were punished by God, and they had to wander in the wilderness for another 37 and a half years. So it made up a 40-year period of time. If you have unbelief in your life, my friends, take Caleb's example. Grasp hold of the same type of faith that Caleb had. Trust God's word. Have that confidence in God. Learn what God has promised. And trust and believe it. Because if obedience is involved in that, then we need to obey. God fulfills every promise he always has. And those he hasn't, it's not yet time. Caleb believed God. Go to Joshua 14. Caleb trusted God. Joshua 14, we know it, but it's less known excuse me, than our other passage in Numbers 13 and that account. We know about this, but we may not think about and know the details of what's taking place here. And I want to read this whole chapter for you. It's pretty short, really, but I just want you to see what is happening. Chapter 14, verse 1 of Joshua. Now these are the areas the Israelites received as an inheritance in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar the priest, Joshua the son of Nun, and the heads of the tribal clans of Israel allotted to them. That's talking about everything that was presented before in chapter 13 and before that. In verse 2, their inheritances were assigned by lot to the 9.5 tribes as the Lord had commanded through Moses. Moses had granted the 2.5 tribes their inheritance on the east of the Jordan, but had not granted the Levites an inheritance among the rest, for the sons of Joseph had become 2 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim. The Levites received no share of the land, but only towns to live in, with the pasture lands for their flocks and herds. So the Israelites divided up the land just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Okay, Israel has taken the land. 9.5 of the tribes are living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and 2.5 tribes live east of the Jordan River. Okay? Most of us don't think of east of the Jordan as part of Israel, but it was. That was part of the land. Jordan River was not the boundary of the land. Now, verse 6. Now the men of Judah approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, said to him, You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, at Kadesh Barnea, about you and me? I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land. And I brought him back a report according to my convictions. But my brothers who went up with me made the hearts of the people melt with fear. I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly, or fully, the way I quoted it in the funeral sermon. So on that day, Moses, notice that's the first time that it's said. So on that day, Moses swore to me, the land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance, and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. There's the second time it's said. Now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years since the time he said this to Moses, while Israel moved about in the desert. So here I am today, 85 years old. I am still as strong today as then. Now give me this hill country so that the Lord promised me that day. You yourself heard then that the Anakites were there, and their cities were large and fortified. But the Lord helping me, I will drive them out, just as he said. And Joshua blessed Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and gave him Hebron as his inheritance. So Hebron has belonged to Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, ever since, because he followed the Lord, the God of Israel, wholeheartedly. There's your third time it's said. And the last line of that passage is, then the land rested from war. You know the Canaanites were pagan people, don't you? They worshiped idols and false gods, and much of what they did religiously was for fertility purposes, so that they have a lot of kids, so that the land would produce a healthy harvest, a healthy crop, and when the enemies would come, when they would have to battle, they prayed and sacrificed so that they could be victorious over their enemies. And so I imagine that when Israel has crossed the Jordan River and they're camped out in the plain of Jericho, right in the side of the city of Jericho, the people in Jericho were going, oh no. You know, if they were cussing, they would use their God's name. Oh my Buddha, or whatever the name of their God would be. You know, they're scared to death. And they're seeing the encampment with a couple million people, and the fires and the noise and of this giant encampment. And they're looking and they're trembling. Rahab says they're afraid of you a little bit later when she talks to the spies. And so what happens? The leaders, maybe the ruler of the city of Jericho, has all their priests sacrificing to their gods like crazy, praying for protection and victory against this army that's going to come against them. Now you know that the land of Canaan wasn't a unified country, don't you? It wasn't a unified country with one government ruling over it all. It was a series of city-states, as they call it, where a city like Jericho had a king or a ruler in it, and he ruled that city and the surrounding area. And there were several of those all over the land. That's why you have the Perizzites and the Jebusites and the Hittites and others, as those different groups and city-states. And oftentimes they might war against themselves, against each other, but when a common enemy from outside would come in, they would often try to get together and fight. Well, we know that God has led Israel in the land. It's taking a few years for them to conquer the land. And each of the 12 tribes is now assuming or taking the area that's been designated to them to possess. And one of the interesting things to me is that the other tribes help each tribe take its land. So if they're helping, let's say Judah, they're helping Judah take the area that's Judah. Once that's done, Judah goes and helps everybody take. So they're helping each other take their portion of the land so that they can settle the land. And when the tribes have taken possession, the tribes are settled. That's when Caleb, who has been helping everyone else settle the land, knew it was now his turn. He had been trusting God now since that day when God punished the Israelites because of their unbelief. He trusted God for 45 years. Despite the 10 unfaithful spies and unfaithful Israel, he trusted God all that time. Now here he is. He's 85 years of age. And he's going to go up and take the land that God had promised him. And here's the interesting thing, it's not going to be easy. It's mountainous. We live in hills. So say that they're living there. He's taking an area that's similar, maybe higher, taller hills or taller mountains than what we have around here. And it's filled with the giants. It's the land where the giants live. You know, David isn't the only one that fought giants. We see Caleb fighting before David did. But did you notice Caleb's word in verses 10, 11, and 12? The Lord has kept me. I am vigorous to go to battle. And with the Lord's help, I will win. Not, I am going to do this with the Lord's help. It's always about God. It's always about God. That's where we need to be. Regardless of our age, and we could be in our 20s, we could be in our 90s, or anywhere in between, but we need to have a courageous trust in God that never wavers. It has to be firmly set and established for us because we know God will provide, God will help, God will save. God keeps his promises. And so our faith is anchored through Jesus, whom God has sent for us. You know the Lord has kept you. You understand that. And he continues to be the source of your strength for life and provides for you what you need. And because of that confident trust, God can invigorate you to go to battle. And that's a battle with the devil. That's why one of the reasons why I had Gary read Ephesians 6:12 about the armor of God, about the spiritual battle that we're fighting. But we're fighting the battle. And part of the battle is winning the lost to Jesus Christ and leading and mentoring them in discipleship and as they follow. And with the Lord's help, we will win. 2 weeks ago, it would have been 1 week ago if we'd been in preach this sermon last week. 2 weeks ago, I offered a challenge to the congregation to work together to reach our community with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Here's what the challenge was. First of all, that we, over the next 10 years, reach 1% of our community with the gospel. That's not just inviting them to church, but we're literally reaching them with the gospel. Ideally, each of those that we reach with the gospel will accept Jesus Christ and be saved. And we want to effectively share the gospel with 1% of our community over the next 10 years. Why 1%? Why not 2 or 3 or 5 or 10? Well, our community is growing at about a rate of 1% a year. And so, one goal is to try to keep up with that. But at the same time, when we do this, we do it by the power of God and let God work through us. I bet you would see more than 1% reached. But that's the goal. Also, that we see our church grow, the population of our congregation grow by 10% over the next 10 years. It wouldn't be surprised me to see God multiply that growth if we are faithful to God in our aims. And that we see 100% of the congregation participate in the outreach of this congregation, however that may look, whatever that may look like. You know, we've got a couple of good opportunities coming up. Easter is coming. That's a good opportunity for outreach. Never thought about it until Gary mentioned it the other day, St. Patrick's Day. That might be a good opportunity for outreach. But here's the thing, through prayer, through the Holy Spirit, through your faithfulness, God can accomplish all of this and much, much more. There's more to our faith than just reaching the lost with the gospel, obviously. That's just an emphasis at this point. There's the spiritual growth of each and every Christian. That's important as well. There's your stand of faith in this world that is tempting you to sin and trying to draw you and pull you away from the Lord. When we look at Caleb, and Caleb was so confident in the Lord, some might even think he lacked humility. I don't believe that, because sometimes confidence looks like pride. But Caleb didn't trust in himself, did he? He trusted in God. And he conquered the mountains, and he conquered the giants to make his portion of the land of Canaan God's. I shared with you about Glenn Harpster earlier. Glenn had been an elder at the church, and he challenged the leaders regularly, and they didn't make many friends there. He led Bible studies, and he really encouraged people to faith and good works. And he was concerned very especially with the lost. Many conversations, many things I did with him was about trying to win the lost to Christ. He was a huge supporter of the campus ministry up at Kirksville, Missouri. He supported foreign missionaries, not just the ones we did through the church, but on his own, personally. And he worked together with me and the church and others when he was part of the family that didn't know Christ yet, as well as others that were far away from God in our community and around. But why did he do this? Because of the confidence and belief that he had in God. That's what we can say about Caleb too, isn't it? And let's see if we can't make that what people can say about us too. We want to do all this for God's glory though. Not so we can say, look at us, look how great we are. We had 258 in church Sunday. So, how many are Christians? How many are faithful? How many are growing in the Lord? How many people have you won to the Lord? And we want to do it for God's glory, not for ours. We want to follow Caleb's example of faithfulness to God and courage and trust in the Lord God for everything. Because he took a land that probably would not have been able to be won without the power of God. We're trying to win souls to Jesus Christ, and we're trying to grow in our faith, and I don't believe that we would be able to accomplish that without the power of God in our lives. Let's follow Caleb's example. Father, as we